In the shadows of the past, before writing, cities, and agriculture, human beings already fought for survival with tooth and nail, and sometimes with acts that we now consider unthinkable. Among the tribal fires and dark caves, a shocking behavior repeats itself in archaeological remains around the world: cannibalism. But why did the first humans eat each other? Was it out of necessity, ritual, or domination? Today, we will travel to the dawn of humanity to understand one of the oldest taboos of our species. Prepare for a journey among marked bones, lost traditions, and unsettling truths, like the impressive story of the giant humans who preyed on Neanderthals. This can be frightening. There is evidence that almost all species of ancient humans practiced cannibalism at some point. That's right, there are moments in human history that defy our modern understanding of morality, instinct, and survival. Imagine a human group trapped by icy mountains, isolated from the world, hungry, with no prospect of hunting or foraging. In extreme scenarios like this, survival cannibalism emerged not as a choice, but as the last hope. In these contexts, the taboo was overcome by necessity. The body of a loved one became sustenance for the others. But cannibalism among ancient humans may have even more terrifying reasons. The act of consuming the dead could have had spiritual significance. Was funerary and ritualistic cannibalism a way to preserve the essence of the deceased, to honor their memory, to allow their life force to continue among the living? In other times and places, cannibalism could take on a darker character: war. Cannibalism practiced as a demonstration of power, as a way to humiliate enemies, or as a ritual of spiritual domination. Throughout prehistory, various species of ancient humans, that is, different members of the genus Homo, coexisted in time, and, in some cases, even met, fought, lived together, and even interbred genetically. Imagine a dense forest, icy mountains, wild animals roaming in the distance. A group of Homo sapiens arrives in a new region in search of game. While exploring the territory, they find signs of occupation. Footprints, remains of fires, rudimentary. Tools, they are not theirs. They belong to another group. The atmosphere is tense. There is no linguistic understanding, only the presence of the other strange and threatening. When different human groups met, the first reaction was not always peaceful. They saw in the other a direct threat to scarce resources: shelter, game, water. If the environment was hostile, the chance of collaboration decreased, and if there was conflict, the defeated group might not only be killed but devoured. Cannibalism in these contexts arose not only as a gesture of survival, but as a symbolic act of power and total destruction. In caves like Gough's Cave in England, archaeologists have found human bones with clear marks of cutting, dismemberment, and scraping, exactly like the signs left on the bones of slaughtered animals. Even more impressive, skulls were turned into containers. These remains suggest that the Homo sapiens who lived there not only killed other humans, but consumed them. And perhaps these others were from different groups, rivals, foreigners, considered less human. Among Neanderthals, there is also evidence of cannibalism. In El Sidrón, Spain, the remains of individuals show signs of having been processed as food. These practices may have occurred after confrontations between different clans, or even during periods of severe scarcity, in which the living consumed the dead. But when the enemy was different, from another human lineage, the gesture took on new dimensions. It was the elimination of the other, not only in body, but in identity. What archaeology shows is a pattern of extreme behavior in situations of contact. When resources were scarce, the climate severe, and fear constant, aggressiveness took the lead. A defeated group could be enslaved or eliminated, and in cases where a death was the outcome, the body of the defeated enemy was not buried with rituals, but used as food, as a trophy, as a warning to others. Interspecies cannibalism reminds us that human history is also the history of the fear of the other, of how we deal with what is different, of how the recognition of similarity can be overcome by distrust, conflict, and violence. Even in more recent times, cannibalism between human groups continued to emerge in extreme contexts: wars, sieges, shipwrecks. Prehistory was no exception. Instead of organized armies, there were clans. Instead of treaties, the silence of stone. Weapons, and instead of cemeteries, remains scattered in caves with signs that the dead were the meal of the living. In the dark corridors of time, among fossils and legends, a powerful image persists, that of the Cro-Magnons as giants. The Cro-Magnons emerged in Europe about 40,000 years ago, during the period known as the Upper Paleolithic. When their first fossils were discovered in 1868 in the Cro-Magnon cave in southern France, scientists of the time were impressed. Skeletons presented remarkable characteristics: tall stature, a broad skull, and a robust jaw, with an average height estimated between 1.75 and 1.85 meters, significantly taller than the Neanderthals and well above the average for medieval humans. Cro-Magnons commanded a presence. In comparison with Europeans of the Middle Ages, many of whom did not exceed 1.60 meters, the Cro-Magnons seemed like giants. This height difference fueled the popular and academic imagination. In an era when little was known about human evolution, the discovery of these large, strong, and ancient bodies generated as much fascination as mystery. Who were these people who, in the midst of the Ice Age, walked with long strides across glacial Europe? With dense bones, a broad chest, and defined muscles, as inferred from the muscle attachment points on the skeletons, the Cro-Magnons were physically impressive. They were hunters, moved through vast areas, and faced prehistoric beasts. Their physical constitution reflected febrile demands of the environment in which they lived. To survive, they needed strength, endurance, and ingenuity. Anatomically, the Cro-Magnons had larger skulls than ours, not only in absolute size, but also in brain volume, with some reaching 1,600 cubic centimeters, surpassing the average for modern Homo sapiens. This fact, combined with their bone robustness and tall stature, fueled theories about a possible physical and intellectual superiority. Although controversial, this idea persisted for decades. They were hunter-gatherers who roamed large territories, following the migrations of animals like mammoths, reindeer, and bison. They used spears, knives, and harpoons made of stone, bone, and wood in an ingenious adaptation to the wild environment of the Ice Age. Their art, perhaps their most moving legacy, remains alive on the walls of caves like Lascaux, Chauvet, and Altamira. In these natural galleries, animals run, hunt, and live in paintings of impressive realism and sophistication. They were not just aesthetic representations, but possibly rituals, spiritual records, expressions of a symbolic thought that already outlined what would become human culture. The Cro-Magnons also developed adornments necklaces made of teeth, shells, and stones indicating an aesthetic sense and perhaps a social structure. Burials with offerings suggest beliefs in an afterlife, feelings of belonging, and respect for loved ones. They lived in groups with bonds that went by in survival bonds of community, language, and identity. Contrary to what many imagine, the Cro-Magnons are not an extinct species. They are, in fact, our direct ancestors, the first modern Homo sapiens in Europe. Over time, they merged with other populations, adapted, and evolved. We are them. Their genes run in our blood. Their heritage shapes our way of seeing the world. For more than 30,000 years, the Cro-Magnons coexisted with the Neanderthals, another human species that inhabited the European continent. These encounters could end in inevitable confrontations and even possible predation. But what would this predation be like? For that, we need to understand the context. The Cro-Magnons were exceptional hunters, skilled strategists capable of organizing coordinated attacks and manipulating the environment to their advantage. They used throwable spears, traps, bait, and techniques that surpassed those of the Neanderthals. While Neanderthals hunted in short-distance ambushes and preferred direct confrontations, the Cro-Magnons could attack from a distance with safety. Their superior technology gave them an advantage. When they encountered small groups of Neanderthals, who were isolated, hungry, or in smaller numbers, they might have seen them not just as competitors, but as opportunities. The motivation could be multiple: competition for territory, suppression of rivals. But in times of scarcity, where food was difficult to find and winters were lethal, even the most unthinkable could become viable. The bodies of the Neanderthals, anatomically strong and well-nourished, represented a valuable caloric source. And if there were no cultural barriers after all, the Cro-Magnons were still forming a culture. The line between hunting an animal and hunting a different hominid might not have been as rigid as we imagine today. Predation in these terms does not mean a declared war, but specific, furtive, systematic actions. A group of Cro-Magnons could ambush Neanderthals during migration, near water sources, or on the edges of hunting areas. They were adaptable, mobile, and used the territory with intelligence. The Neanderthals, on the other hand, tended to be more static, grouping in specific regions, which made them predictable. Targets. The signs of this violence are subtle but present. Besides the marks on the bones, there is the sudden decline of Neanderthal populations in areas where the Cro-Magnons had recently arrived. In some regions, like the south of France and the north of the Iberian Peninsula, the Neanderthals disappear within a few generations after the arrival of sapiens. Coincidence? Perhaps, but the pattern repeats. And there is the silence of the Neanderthals. No defense artifacts, siege structures, or signs of prolonged resistance were left behind. In many places, they were erased, as if they had been systematically replaced. And the substitute, the Cro-Magnon, brought not only tools and art, but also a new order, an order where there was no more space for the other. The predation theory also finds an echo in the cultural practices of the Cro-Magnons. On other occasions, we know that they practiced cannibalism, at least within their own group, as demonstrated in Gough's cave. If this was culturally acceptable, the consumption of human flesh was not a universal taboo. This opens the possibility that under extreme pressure, the flesh of the other, even if that other was almost human, was seen as a legitimate alternative. But these encounters, previously seen as inevitable confrontations, are now understood in a more complex way. There is evidence of interbreeding between the species, of cultural and technological exchanges. The Cro-Magnons may have learned from the Neanderthals, and vice versa. The disappearance of the Neanderthals remains a mystery, but the presence of the Cro-Magnons helped build a new narrative for humanity. In their open-air camps or in the depths of caves, the Cro-Magnons created a daily life shaped by adaptation, ingenuity, and instinct. They observed the stars, followed the cycles of the moon and the seasons, mastered fire, made clothes from sewn skins, and cared for the injured and the sick. With each gesture, they drew the outlines of civilization. Archaeological discoveries continue to surprise. Sophisticated tools like burins and scrapers, bone needles with perfect holes, rudimentary musical instruments like flutes made from bird bones. The creativity of the Cro-Magnons knew no bounds. Even in the face of adversity, a rich, complex, and profoundly human culture flourished. The archaeological sites of Europe are silent witnesses to this trajectory. In every bone fragment, in every flint flake, in every ochre pigment, pulses the life of a people who braved the unknown. The past of the Cro-Magnons is not buried. It Breathes, speaks, inspires. We are their heirs, and the world we know today rests on the foundations they built. As new analysis technologies advance, more details emerge about the diet, rituals, movements, and social relations of the Cro-Magnons. Ancient DNA reveals kinship, migrations, and interbreeding with other groups. Prehistory ceases to be a nebulous land and becomes a vivid portrait of the human adventure. And it is impossible not to feel a certain awe when imagining the gaze of a Cro-Magnon fixing on us across the millennia. A gaze that saw the world in its rawest, wildest, most authentic state. A gaze that understood the beauty, the danger, and the mystery of existence. The legacy of the Cro-Magnons goes beyond physical remains. It is present in our search for meaning, in the art we create, in the way we organize ourselves in society. They were the first to understand that living is more than surviving. It is building, feeling, expressing. It is giving meaning to time, to space, and to life. And so, in every visited cave, in every found object, in every research conducted, we retell the story of the Cro-Magnons, a story that is, in essence, our own. A story that invites us to look back not with longing, but with respect, and to move forward with the certainty that we are part of an extraordinary lineage that began long before we knew what it meant to be human. Imagine a time when the gods did not yet have names, when death was a constant, and the spiritual world mixed with the physical world with a frightening naturalness. Now imagine the figure of a human being covered in animal skins, their face hidden by a mask made of bones, a boar's jaw, a deer's skull, inlaid human teeth. It was not fantasy. It was ritual. It was control. It was psychological power incarnate. The first ritual masks of humanity were not made to celebrate. They were created to dominate, to intimidate, to terrorize. Archaeologists have found in Paleolithic and Mesolithic sites indications that certain ancient human groups used bone fragments to fashion face adornments that went beyond protection or ornamentation. They were masks, and their use was linked to practices that mixed war, spirituality, and primitive psychology. Imagine facing a rival in the gloom of a forest or at the entrance of a cave and seeing before you a figure with black, still eyes shrouded in the bones of other humans and animals. The mind, already weakened by fear, gives way. The battle is won before the first blow is struck. This was the objective: absolute intimidation. The bone masks were psychological armor used by leaders, warriors, shamans, or elite hunters to become, more than men, to become living myths. The evidence is in the details: precisely worked skulls, jaws pierced to be tied, fragments of polished bones with marks of use. In some cases, traces of pigments around the eye sockets. These masks were not accidental. They were objects that were thought out, built, and used repeatedly in battles, hunting rituals, initiation ceremonies, or executions. But why bones? Because bones carry an ancestral symbolism. They are the last part to disappear. They are structure, permanence, a vestige of life. To wear the bone of an enemy or a powerful animal was a gesture of appropriation, of absorbing their strength, their memory, their essence. It was also a warning. What was his is now mine. Each mask was a trophy, each tooth a memory of victory, each crack a story told in silence. The Homo Sapiens who made and wore these masks knew the impact they had. They manipulated fear, knew how to provoke, how to frighten, how to paralyze the other. In times when there was no written language, symbolic communication was everything, and nothing spoke louder than the face of the unknown covered by mortal remains. It was terror transformed into strategy. And it was not just between enemies. Within the groups themselves, these masks could be used in rituals of power. A leader wore the mask to impose authority, a shaman to invoke spirits, a hunter to channel the essence of the prey. The young who saw them felt respect, fear, and reverence. The mask was a bridge between worlds, the human and the divine, the natural and the supernatural, the living and the dead. In a distant past, long before Homo sapiens conquered the world, a human species dominated Europe, parts of Asia, and Africa. Its name, Homo heidelbergensis. Living from about 700,000 to 200,000 years ago, they were the direct ancestors of the Neanderthals and possibly even of sapiens. Strong, resilient, and intelligent, these ancient humans left deep marks on prehistory. And among these marks, one of them intrigues and haunts archaeologists to this day: cannibalism. Homo heidelbergensis was a species adapted to severe environments. It survived the unpredictable climate of the Pleistocene, aggressive megafauna, and constant competition for resources. And it was in this context that, in extreme moments, the consumption of human flesh emerged as a strategy or ritual of survival. The most impressive testimony of this practice comes from a place in Spain, Cima de los Huesos, or Pit of Bones, in the Sierra de Atapuerca. At this archaeological site, excavated in a deep cave, archaeologists found the remains of at least 28 individuals of Homo heidelbergensis. Many of these skeletons show signs of trauma, intentional fractures, and cut marks. Forensic analysis suggests that some of these bones were broken in a manner consistent with marrow extraction, a common technique of food consumption. For scholars, there is little doubt it was cannibalism. But what kind of cannibalism? Was it for survival, practiced in times of scarcity? Or was it ritualistic, part of a transition ceremony or ancestor worship? The answer remains shrouded in mystery. The fact that the bodies were together, carefully accumulated in a remote and hard-to-reach place, suggests something beyond the instinct to kill and eat. Perhaps Cima de los Huesos was a burial site. Perhaps it was an altar. Perhaps both. The idea that Homo heidelbergensis practiced ritual cannibalism is not absurd. Even without a developed symbolic language like ours, there are signs of complex behavior, tool use, social organization, care for the injured. Cannibalism, in this case, could have served as a way of dealing with death, of absorbing the spirit of the dead, of keeping the memory of those who were gone alive, literally. And there was still the brutal reality of survival. In regions where the winter was harsh and resources were scarce, groups of Homo heidelbergensis could face impossible choices. In those moments, the corpse of a companion, an elder, or even a rival could become a source of food. It is an extreme behavior, but understandable in light of the constant struggle for life. Cannibalism may also have occurred between rival groups. It is not impossible to imagine confrontations between clans, battles for territory, for food, for dominance. And after victory, the bodies of the vanquished could be consumed as a gesture of revenge, of domination, or of absorbing power. This practice, later repeated in much later human cultures, may have deep roots in the time of Homo heidelbergensis. The marks on the bones do not lie, precise cuts that efficiently remove flesh, long fractures in the leg and arm bones, indicating access to marrow, one of the most nutritious parts of the body. In some cases, even the skulls were broken, suggesting the consumption of the brain. These are gestures that echo dietary practices, not just violence. For Homo heidelbergensis, the line between man and food could be thin, not out of barbarism, but out of necessity and possibly tradition. In times when the gods did not yet have names and rituals were performed with fire, stone, and blood, the human body had multiple meanings. It was a vehicle of energy, of essence, of ancestral memory. The discovery of Cima de los Huesos is not isolated. At other sites, like Bodo, Ethiopia, Fossils attributed to Homo heidelbergensis also show marks that may indicate post-mortem manipulation. If it is not cannibalism, it is at least a sign of ritual treatment of the corpse, which already reveals a level of complexity and awareness of death rarely associated with such ancient species. Homo heidelbergensis did not leave art. They did not leave words, but they left bones. Bones that tell stories. Stories of survival, of conflict, of community, and perhaps of funerary banquets. They were humans in formation, bearers of a future. They did not yet comprehend. And among their acts, cannibalism appears as a behavior that destabilizes our ideas about morality, instinct, and culture. Today, we look at these ancestors with distance and fascination. We try to understand why. In such an ancient world, human flesh could have value. We try to see in them something of ourselves, and at the same time, something that was left behind. But perhaps the cannibalism of Homo heidelbergensis is less a deviation and more a response to the unforgiving conditions of their existence. In their bones, we see a humanity still raw, but already capable of intense gestures, capable of hunting, of caring, of fighting, and of consuming their own. The history of Homo heidelbergensis is written in fragments, but each fragment brings us closer to a time when humans were still learning what it meant to be human. And in that ancestral lesson, cannibalism was perhaps an inevitable stage. The diet of Homo heidelbergensis was primarily carnivorous. Archaeological evidence, especially cut marks on the bones of large mammals, indicates that these ancient humans were skilled hunters. They sought large animals, ancient elephants, wild, horses, rhinos, wild oxen, and even hippos. The meat of these animals was highly nutritious and could sustain a group for days. But to bring down prey of this size, planning, cooperation, and sharp tools were necessary. Using wooden spears hardened by fire and carved stone blades, Homo heidelbergensis organized collective hunts. Success required knowledge of the territory, observation of animal behavior, patience, and strength. Ambushes in natural corridors, like valleys and slopes, were common strategies. Once the prey was down, the group quickly processed the meat to avoid the arrival of predators and used everything: muscle, fat, marrow, skin, and bones. But they did not live on meat alone. These humans also collected what nature offered: wild fruits, edible roots, tubers, seeds, leaves, and even honey were part of their diet. This gathering was done by women, children, and elders who had a deep knowledge of the plants in their surroundings. They knew which ones caused stomach aches, which ones were tasty, which ones could be used in infusions or applied to wounds. It was a wisdom transmitted through gestures, repetition, and survival. The diet also included insects, bird eggs, small reptiles, and fish. When they found rivers and lakes, Homo heidelbergensis took advantage of the opportunities. They fished with their hands, caught turtles, and collected shellfish. Nothing was wasted. Any source of protein was valuable in a world where the next meal was never guaranteed. In some cases, the food came from more controversial sources: other humans. Archaeological sites like Cima de los Huesos in Spain reveal marks on human bones. That suggests cannibalism, perhaps in times of extreme hunger, perhaps as a ritual. The bones were broken to extract marrow, the skulls opened with precision. Homo heidelbergensis, when pressed, could turn the body of a fellow human into a source of sustenance. But even in the most extreme dietary practices, there was a clear trace of ingenuity. Homo heidelbergensis knew how to use fire, at least to manipulate the environment, and perhaps to cook. There is still debate among archaeologists about when cooking actually began, but there are already indications of intentional manipulation of fire in this period. The heat served to soften roots, roast meat, ward off predators, and preserve food for longer. Preservation, by the way, was a constant challenge. Without salt, without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly. But rudimentary techniques were employed. Drying in the sun, smoking in caves, storing in covered holes. What could not be eaten immediately was hidden or shared. Solidarity was also a survival technology. The environment directly influenced the diet. In tropical regions, the base could be more plant-based. In cold climates, meat dominated. And in all cases, adaptability was key. When the large animals migrated, Homo heidelbergensis followed. When a plant stopped flowering, they sought another. The diet was not static. It was a reflection of the intimate relationship with the territory. Eating was not just biological. It was social. Eating was a collective act. Hunting required cooperation. Sharing kept the group together. Food created bonds, reinforced leadership, and determined the value of each member of the community. Those who knew how to hunt or identify safe plants had prestige. Food was power. Over time, the dietary practices of Homo heidelbergensis shaped their physiology. Strong teeth, wide jaws, a resilient stomach. The body was adapted to extract the maximum from a tough, fibrous, sometimes raw diet. This diet helped sustain larger brains, stronger bodies, and more complex societies. Today, by studying the remains of food, hunting tools, and the bones preserved in caves, we reconstruct a diet that was both brutal and ingenious. Homo heidelbergensis ate what they could, how they could, and thus they lived for hundreds of thousands of years. They fed their bodies, and with them, they fed the future of humanity. With spears, with watchful eyes, with sharp instinct, they secured their next meal, and the next, until one day their lineage divided, transformed, and from them, new species were born, including us. The food they hunted, gathered, and shared continues, in a way, to sustain us. Because without it, without that daily act of eating to live, human history would never have begun. In a world without maps, without guaranteed shelter, where the cold cut the skin and hunger was a constant, human beings took their first steps toward survival. Our ancient ancestors faced challenges that shaped not only their bodies, but also their minds, their societies, their beliefs. The history of humanity is, above all, a history of resistance. And to understand how we prospered, we must first understand what we fought against. The greatest enemy from the beginning was the environment. The land of prehistory was a ruthless place. During the Pleistocene, long ice ages covered vast regions with ice and snow. Temperatures dropped to extreme levels. The wind was cruel, food scarce. Natural refuges like caves were disputed with predators. And even in the milder periods, the climate changed too quickly to allow for accommodation. Surviving required constant adaptation. Hunting was a dangerous task. To secure a meal, our ancestors faced enormous and lethal animals. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, giant bison, cave bears. Weapons were simple, often made of stone and wood. A mistake, a miscalculation, meant death. And even when successful, it was necessary to share the meat with the group, protect it from scavengers, and preserve it for days without refrigeration. Each meal was a conquest. Besides hunting, there was gathering. Women, children, and elders traveled great distances in search of fruits, roots, seeds, and honey. But not everything that was found was edible. Toxic plants, poisonous fungi, and seasonal scarcity made eating a game of trial and error. Knowledge accumulated slowly, passed down through generations as a sacred treasure. Another major obstacle was disease. Without medicine, without structured hygiene, infections spread easily. Simple wounds could be fatal. Parasites, bacteria, and viruses that are common and treatable today were death sentences. The human body, however, began to evolve defenses. The groups that resisted better left more descendants, and thus, slowly, our species grew stronger. Fire was a game changer. When the first humans learned to control it, everything changed. The heat allowed the occupation of colder regions. The light kept nocturnal predators away, and cooking food increased its digestibility. Fire became the center of social life, a symbol of protection, a tool of culture. Around it, stories, alliances, and decisions were born. But there were also internal threats. Living in a group required trust, rules, leadership. Internal conflicts could destroy fragile communities. Therefore, rudimentary structures of organization arose. The authority of the elders, sharing rituals, the implicit codes of survival. Social cohesion was a vital technology. Language, still in its early stages, was another trump card. Signs, sounds, gestures gradually transformed into speech. This allowed knowledge to be transmitted with more precision, to coordinate hunts, to teach techniques, to preserve stories. Language was the invisible tool that contributed most to our survival. In their migrations, ancient humans faced oceans, deserts, forests, and mountains. They crossed ice bridges between continents, learned to navigate even without a compass. Each new land presented new challenges: unknown predators, hostile climates, new bacteria. But curiosity, ingenuity, and the ability to adapt allowed each obstacle to become a learning experience. Art also played a fundamental role. Cave paintings, sculptures, and primitive musical instruments show that the human spirit sought meaning. This strengthened social bonds, the cohesion of the group. Celebrating the hunt, honoring the dead, expressing fear and hope, all of this helped maintain unity and give meaning to suffering. Over time, more refined tools emerged. Flint flakes gave way to carefully shaped points, bows, harpoons, and nets. Mastery over the environment expanded. Agriculture would come much later. But already there in the Paleolithic, human beings were beginning to master their destiny. It was not an easy journey. For every group that prospered, many disappeared. For every lineage that survived, several were extinguished. But the human species learned, resisted, evolved. It became the master of fire, of the hunt, of shelter, of language. And above all, master of itself. The history of ancient humans is marked by overcoming. Their greatest difficulties became our greatest strengths. The cold gave us clothes, hunger gave us agriculture, darkness gave us fire, fear gave us myths, fragility gave us society. And so it was that step by step, with bare feet and watchful eyes, humanity walked towards the world we know today. They had no certainties, no maps, but they had will. And it is this indomitable, instinctive, ancestral will that still pulses in our bodies today. We are the descendants of those who did not give up, of those who faced the impossible, of those who, against all odds, learned to live and to prosper. Imagine the world 300,000 years ago, not with lights, defined paths, and technology in every pocket, but a raw, wild world dominated by dense forests, open fields, and lurking dangers. Now imagine this world after sunset, a complete darkness, the moon barely outlining the shadows, the silence heavy. But there, in the middle of the African savanna, human eyes light up. It's time to hunt. They were not just hunters. They were predators among predators. Homo heidelbergensis and the first Homo sapiens did not wait for the safety of dawn. They faced the unknown of the night, and they did not do it alone. They hunted in groups, in an organized, coordinated way. They were there out of necessity and turned the darkness into an ally. These nocturnal hunts were acts of pure audacity. Sharing the territory with lions, giant hyenas, and saber-toothed leopards, humans knew that any mistake meant death. But hunger spoke louder. And then came the signs. Short, Almost inaudible whistles guided their movements. Embers in their hands, hidden under leaves, flickered like watchful eyes. Each step was silent, each breath controlled. And the moon, when present, was a compass and a beacon. There was no flashlight, no protection, only courage. Thepri could be an antelope on watch, a hippopotamus sleeping in the mud, a sharp-toothed boar. The humans approached slowly, like shadows that became lethal. When the attack was launched, there was no hesitation. Hardened wooden spears flew with precision, firm, silent blows. The death had to be quick because the sound would attract larger predators, and they were always nearby. Fossils found in regions of Africa prove these practices. Prey bones with impact marks, perforations caused by spears, fractures characteristic of human ambushes. In some cases, human bones were found alongside those of large animals, which suggests that not all returned alive, that the risk was real, that the hunt could easily turn into tragedy. But still, they returned night after night. They improved. Their tactics learned the paths of the animals, the patterns of movement, the sounds of the wind. The forest spoke, the field whispered, and the humans listened. This sensitivity to the environment, this mastery of the darkness, was an evolutionary advantage. It was the beginning of what would become the strategic human brain. The nocturnal hunt was more than survival. It was a rite, a proof of belonging. Young people learned from the elders, the brave led, the silent guided. The hunts united, strengthened. Trust and guaranteed the food that would sustain the entire community for days. Meat and fat, bones rich in marrow, everything was used. But the most impressive thing was the almost instinctive behavior. There were no maps, no written strategies. There was memory, experience, and a collective understanding transmitted from generation to generation about how to survive in the darkness. They moved as a single organism. When one attacked, all attacked. When one stopped, all stopped. The coordination was not taught. It was felt. On these nights, the terror was real, but terror was also a weapon. Screams were avoided. Pain was suppressed. An injured member knew that if they alarmed the predators, they would put everyone at risk. Silence was survival, and the spilled blood was part of the price paid to the night, to nature, to the death that always lurked so close. This behavior reveals something profound about ancient humans. Their ability to adapt was absolute. Where there was light, they created strategies. Where there was shadow, they created courage. But night was not the refuge of the fearful. It was the stage of the audacious. And there, under the veil of darkness, our ancestors defined what it meant to be human. Because it was not just about killing. It was about resisting. It was about advancing against the unknown, even knowing that the price could be high. By doing. This night after night, Homo heidelbergensis and the first Homo sapiens not only secured food, they forged the spirit of humanity, the ability to plan, to join forces, to overcome the impossible. Today, with our illuminated streets and overflowing supermarkets, it is difficult to imagine this world. But it lives in our genetic memory, in the traits we have inherited, in the primitive fears, in the impulses we still feel in the face of. Darkness, the courage of our ancestors, still inhabits us because it was what brought us here. They hunted in the gloom, they faced monsters, they did not retreat. And thanks to them, we wake up each day with the sun in our eyes and the past pulsing in our bones. In a world where the night was a constant danger and the cold could kill, fire became one of the greatest achievements of humanity. Warming, illuminating, cooking, protecting the mastery of fire was a turning point in prehistory. But not everything that shines is just light. Because for some groups of ancient humans, fire was not just a survival tool, it was a weapon. A weapon of war, a weapon of terror. Recent archaeological research reveals something surprising and disturbing. There is evidence that primitive Homo sapiens and even groups of Neanderthals learned to use fire as a strategic instrument in territorial confrontations. Caves in Europe and African plains show layers of charcoal, traces of combustion, and charred human bones. And these clues do not tell stories of accidents. They tell stories of intentions. Imagine a nomadic group approaching a perfect cave, natural shelter, water source, elevated position. But it is already occupied. The newcomers know that a direct confrontation could be dangerous, so they opt for another tactic. They surround the entrance with dry branches, light small fires on the flanks of the hill, and spread dense smoke. The air becomes unbreathable, the heat unbearable. The occupants have nowhere to flee. In a few minutes, the fire and fear doth dirty work. In some cases, there was no chance of escape. Excavations have revealed human bones burned inside gorges and caves in layers that coincide with marks of intentional fire. The distribution of the bodies, the degree of carbonization, and the presence of ash in circular patterns suggest that it was not a natural fire. It was an ambush with flames. This practice shows a dark aspect of the ancient human mind, the ability to use fear as a weapon. The fire that protected against predators was now used to eliminate rivals. The smoke suffocated, the flames blocked escape routes. The crackling of the embers was the sound of planned panic. And whoever served carried the memory and the warning. Archaeologists call this the strategic use of fire. It was not just a war tactic. It was a lesson transmitted between generations, a refined technique taught as part of the cultural arsenal, like throwing spears, building traps, or following tracks. Burning the enemy was an option learned, repeated, perfected. And with it, a new era of human conflicts arose. There are records that this practice was not isolated. In different parts of Central Europe, layers of charcoal over layers of human. Occupation indicate that provoked fires were common in times of dispute. In some regions of East Africa, similar patterns show that fire was used not only to hunt animals, but to dislodge other humans. The line between hunting and war was beginning to blur. The most frightening thing is that this strategy worked. The psychological terror that fire caused was as effective as the death it brought. A group that saw the fire approaching, that felt the smoke invade their refuge, rarely resisted, because fire left no alternatives. It burned food, destroyed. Weapons made the cave uninhabitable. Even when it didn't kill, it won. And whoever dominated fire dominated the territory. With it, they controlled the environment, created forbidden zones, imposed invisible borders. It was the beginning of a primitive psychological warfare, where power came not only from strength, but from the manipulation of fear. The ancient humans did not need to say a word. It was enough to light a flame in the right place and wait. These remains reconstruct a little discussed facet of human history. Long before gunpowder, long before walls, our ancestors already knew how to turn natural elements into weapons. They already understood that controlling the environment was controlling the other. They already knew that terror could be as effective as brute force. Fire was at the same time warmth and hell, life and death, dominion and destruction. And those who used it as a weapon understood this perfectly. They not only wanted to win, they wanted to leave a message. Here is a story that does not fade easily because it is written in the ashes, in the charred bones, in the blackened walls of the caves of the past. A story of intelligence, of strategy, of fear, and of fire. Always, the fire